let me now bring in our guests on this special broadcast, because this attack has been described as the most audacious, it's been described as stunning, the deepest strike into Russia by Ukraine. It's also been described as reckless. These are some of the adjectives that have been used. What will it lead to? Escalation or ceasefire? Is it reckless to even talk about expansion of conflict beyond Ukraine to other parts of Europe? Is there a real apprehension that this could lead to NATO versus Russia directly? Joining me on this India Today special broadcast is Lieutenant General Raj Shukla. He's former army commander and a commentator on strategic and military affairs. Ambassador Kamal Sibal, former Foreign Secretary of India, has also been our ambassador to Russia. Professor Andrew Latham is an expert on international relations and regional conflict. He joins us on the show. And Jill Bandola is a non-resident fellow at Defense Priorities, and he's a senior research fellow at the Center for Study of Statesmanship. Of course, Sandeep Punithan, my colleague, stays with me on this broadcast. And General Shukla, the most audacious strike on Russia when you look at the scale, size, and result.
Mind-boggling, Gaurav, mind-boggling. You know, I don't know how to describe it. A couple of months back, we saw President Trump telling President Zelensky that you have no cards. I think Ukraine has told Mr. Trump and the world that we have some very significant cards. Ukrainian ingenuity has penetrated the impregnable Russian nuclear force. You know, look at the manner in which you have targeted strategic aviation. You have targeted the maritime leg of the nuclear triad. You have hit the heart of the command and control system of Russia's nuclear force. So to me, it appears that, you know, Russia's nuclear architecture, its first strike options, its second strike assuredness, they are gaping holes there. And all the points that you brought out, you know, the technological innovation, the precision strikes, the thermal imaging AI, the psychological architecture, and it proves that technological innovation is the response to legacy militaries and legacy platforms.
Yes.
I would say tomorrow, in the next 48 hours, India should announce the creation of a drone missile force.
Oh,
Dronery as a science and art has come of age. I have been screaming for the last 3 to 4 years now. This is the first thing we need to do. Now, the only
India
thing
needs
to
a
be seen
massive
is
drone
that
force.
do we introduce dronery as a separate service or dronery as a separate arm? It is like infantry, armor, artillery, a separate arm. And for a while now, Gaurav, 80% of Russian casualties in men and equipment have been caused not by infantry, not by armor, not by artillery, not by air power, but by drones. We must humbly acknowledge the arrival of dronery. It is as, you know, significant a moment as that. And
that's a very significant point you make, sir.
Just 130 seconds. The point you made about costs. When the military component of the power differential with China is $450 billion, one way to bridge it is by investing in unmanned platforms with dronery as the icing on the cake.
That's a very significant point you make, sir. Ambassador Sibal, imaginative planning, but you've also described it as reckless. Why do you think this is reckless, sir? Because many in Russia are describing this as Russia's Pearl Harbor moment.
But isn't that reckless? That Pearl Harbor brought America into the war, and Japan was ultimately incinerated with 2 nuclear bombs. Do we want that to happen in Ukraine or in Europe? This is totally... Look, as a military man, General Shukla is absolutely right to draw military lessons from this and draw military lessons for our own security. And what he's advocating in terms of paying more attention to drone warfare and creating a separate drone command, these are legitimate lessons to be learned from this operation. But that's not the end of the story. There is geopolitics involved. There is war, serious dangers of war on the horizon. You humiliate. It's humiliating for Russia. You humiliate Russia. You attack its nuclear bombers, and you expect that Ukraine will get away with it. And do you think that Ukraine did this alone? First of all, I think, now this is speculation, that they were internal collaborators in Russia. I mean, you can't, or there were such gaps in their in their internal security that these trucks could go in various directions, and the Russian FSB, their intelligence agencies, had no clue as to what was happening. So clearly, there are weaknesses and deficiencies in their system. But to imagine, as was said earlier, that this was being monitored 4,000 kilometers away or 2,000 kilometers away on some screens by the Ukrainians, this is nonsense. There is a hand of Western intelligence and military intelligence agencies and military in this. This is a kind of a quasi-NATO operation. Now,
It's
the
a
thing is,
quasi NATO operation. Sir, would you say Europe or America or both?
well, America is not separate from NATO. Do you think? Do you think Trump controls all this? Now, point is, if Russia attacks and it blows up into something big, then will we be all celebrating or will we be paying the price? It's the global south that will be paying the price if there is wide-ranging war in Europe. It can't be insulated there. Therefore, I don't think that this is a thing that we should celebrate at all. At all. We should be very, very thoughtful and introspect as to what the consequences of this be. And the worst is that when, let's for a moment say that Trump is sincere in trying to find a peaceful solution.
Okay.
And first talks, peace talks in Istanbul happened. The second round was about to take place, and this is when Ukraine triggered this. Now, why did they trigger this? Because Europe and earlier on the Biden administration always believed and said publicly that if negotiations take place, Ukraine should negotiate from a point of strength. And now
Yes.
they believe that this gives them that kind of strength that they were willing to
Okay.
have before negotiations began. And secondly, of course, they're not interested in negotiations. Europe is not interested in negotiations. One of the European leaders, in fact, has said that that war is worse than peace in Ukraine. So I think we should understand the implications for our own sake, for the sake of the global south, for the world in general. This is total
Yes.
recklessness on the part of Ukraine and its backers in Europe.
Professor Latham, is there also your appreciation? One, it's reckless. Two, it's a huge blow to the prestige of the Russians. There will be massive retaliation. And do you agree with Ambassador Sybil that this is a quasi-NATO operation, can't be Ukraine on its own?
Well, there are a whole bunch of questions there. I am Professor Latham, but I'm also a former Canadian Army from a long time ago, so I just want that on the table.
Yes.
But more importantly, we need to get the facts right. First of all, a lot of these drones were shot down, because they always are. Secondly, some planes were destroyed, some were merely damaged. Third, these planes are not being used extensively in the Ukraine war. And that brings us to the most important point here, which is that this is theatrics. It's not strategy. It is not going to change the battlefield one iota. I don't embrace this reality, but it is a reality. The Russians are winning the war on the battlefield in Ukraine. And none of this theatrical nonsense is going to make a jot of difference. None of it. And so I don't think Putin is going to retaliate in any major way. It's not going to escalate into a nuclear war and a war against NATO or anything like that. Putin and the boys have a clear sense they're winning the war incrementally at huge cost, but they're winning. And this little theatrical episode is not going to change that dynamic in the slightest.
Okay. Jill Bandola, is that also your appreciation that one, this is theatrics? This will not help Ukraine either, win the war or change the dynamics on ground.
I agree with Professor Latham to some extent. I think it's not going to change the fundamental battlefield dynamics, and I agree that the idea of major Russian escalation. I mean, I think the only real escalation there is nuclear, and I don't think that's going to happen. I don't think this is going to prompt that or prompt a wider conflict with NATO. But I do think that Ukraine's center of gravity is keeping its army in the field, and to an extent that is keeping the population in the fight. And there is war weariness in Ukraine, no question. And I think that these things, I wouldn't just dismiss them as theatrics. I think they're important for what they show in terms of Ukraine's ability to reach into Russia. And I actually think that's probably unilateral. And I think it's also important for what it does for Ukrainian civilian morale. And I think sometimes, I think Kursk is sort of an example of this. Some of these things can be counterproductive if they're done just to increase Ukrainian morale and have battlefield consequences. But I think this is a real shot in the arm to the Ukrainian people and to their kind of unity behind the government to keep fighting this war. I think that does matter.
Okay, but Sandeep, is that just what this is? A shot in the arm, a morale booster for Ukrainian forces and civilians, or does this have a major implication? One, it's a blow to Russia's prestige. Two, it shows how vulnerable Russia is. Three, the enemy within, because there are reports that seem to indicate that the collaborators were within Russia, one factory site apparently, and these are some reports that are coming in both from Europe and across the Atlantic, that there were some factory sites that have been busted inside Russia where the drones were put together.
Yeah, absolutely, Gaurav. In fact, I'll take the second part of your question first. The fact is that these were first-person view drones, and if you see the footage coming out of these attacks, it suggests that there was an operator in the loop quite close to these targets. So while these first-person view drones might have been launched from the trucks without an operator present, it's quite possible that those operators were present close by to guide the drones to their targets. These couldn't have been done from 2,000, 3,000 kilometers away. So it's quite likely there was a large special forces contingent present around these targets. And Ukraine has demonstrated that in the past. They've had some very successful deep penetration raids into the Russian Federation. Now, about the larger implications of these drone attacks, Gaurav, I tend to agree with what our panelists have said. These are tactically brilliant operations. I mean, these are the kind of special forces operations that we haven't seen using drones. We possibly haven't seen in the history of warfare. But do they alter the situation on the ground? I don't think that's happening, because while they're tactically brilliant, strategically it's a dead end. Ukraine has already lost 20% of its territory to Russia. And Russia, Gaurav, has demonstrated over the last 3 years, we are running into the 4th year soon, Russia has demonstrated an enormous ability to take punishment. And this has been a character of Russia for hundreds of years. And this is, so it doesn't really, alter the situation on the ground in any way. We can go talking all about the brilliance of this operation, but in the long term, I think it looks like the Russians have a winning hand, and therefore they're unlikely to use the nuclear option. They probably retaliate for this operation in some way, given the fact that their nuclear assets have been targeted, their nuclear vectors have been targeted. But I don't see this.
I'll get General Shukla to respond to this. I want to bring in Ambassador Sybil. Sir, you've been an ambassador to Russia. You've been foreign secretary. You've interacted very extensively with the Russians. You understand their thinking. Your appreciation, how would Russia react? Would it punish? Would it carry out punitive strikes inside Ukraine? Would it seek to expand? It's so far been restrained. Is there merit in Ukraine saying Russia has done all it could in the past 3 years, Russia couldn't have done worse?
Look, even now, Russia calls this a special military operation. They have limited their ambitions with about what they want to do in Ukraine. They want to secure these 4 oblasts which have been incorporated into Russia, and they have no intention or plans to go beyond that. Even now, after the Kursk operation and some other attacks that took place, Putin is talking about a buffer in Sumy and other places. There are no plans, no ambitions to actually eliminate Ukraine as a state. This is not true at all. This is just a bogey which is being created, especially by the West, by the Europeans, in order to justify their support for Ukraine. But leave that as it may, there may be different views on this. The second thing is that Russia or Putin actually is relatively a moderate. He's ensuring that things don't go out of hand. He's under a lot of pressure by the hardliners in Russia to react. And in fact, it is quite obvious that Russia has lost a lot of prestige already in its failure to win this war even after over 3 years of fighting. And now with these kind of attacks, it will be very, very difficult for him not to react. Thirdly, he has been warning time and again that there are limits to Russia's patience. And he's been talking about Oreshnik and all that pretty recently. Earlier, he talked about the fact that Russia is a nuclear weapon state in order to dissuade the Europeans and the Ukrainians from crossing too many red lines. My own feeling is Russia will react. And this is exactly what Zelensky and the European supporters want. That if there's a massive retaliation, especially if civilians get killed, then the whole idea of the Ukrainians and the Europeans is to somehow wear away Trump from his path to find some peaceful way out and use all those elements in the United States itself who are unforgiving towards Russia, Lindsey Graham and company, who actually want Russia to be further humiliated and defeated, a strategic defeat in Russia. So the idea is to push America somehow into the war. And that's where the danger is. That's where the danger is. Russia is not going to attack NATO. It's going to attack Ukraine. And if it doesn't, I think Russia will lose enormous prestige and Putin will have a lot of difficulty inside his country, even though he's controlling public opinion and the press. But mind you, it is not a totalitarian state in that sense. There are people who have views on this matter and who agitate their point of view and put pressure on the Kremlin.
Professor Latham, your appreciation, will President Putin hit back? It's a blow to his prestige. Internationally, it's looking at a massive blow to his prestige, even bigger than the sinking, you'd recall, of the Russian Black Sea Fleet flagship Moskva in August 2022. And within Russia, it's being described as their Pearl Harbor moment.
Yeah, well, it's a black eye for Putin and the Russians, to be certain. And I think there already has been limited retaliatory strikes. Will it escalate to the level of war with NATO or the use of nuclear weapons? To me, that's inconceivable. And it's inconceivable for this reason. It's not in Putin's best interests. He knows he's winning the war. And he knows the last thing in the world he wants is for the United States or for the European Union or for NATO to be drawn in anymore. All he needs to do is hunker down, continue what he's doing. Yes, a little bit of signaling in terms of retaliatory strikes, but that's the beginning and the end of it. It's really not going to go beyond that. And I'll say one more thing about the transformation of not the nature of war, which never changes, but the character of war, which does change. And it changes because of technologies. The drone thing is a big deal. It is changing the battlefield in ways that armor changed it once upon a time, for example. And that's something which India and the United States and NATO needs to pay serious attention to. But this particular drone strike, as I said earlier, has affected the battlefield in zero ways. It just hasn't changed anything. Have drones had an impact on the battlefield in Ukraine on both sides? Yes. The American Patriot missiles don't work anymore. Do you know why?
Yes.
Because the Russians have figured out, and this is an age-old dynamic, sword and shield, the Russians have figured out how to use decoys to take the Patriots out of the equation. So we need to be mindful of that. But bottom line in terms of this particular discussion is that these strikes, and I'm going to stick with the narrative that I used earlier, are more theatrical than strategic or even operational, even if they are tactically brilliant, as one of my colleagues said a few minutes ago.
Okay. Theatrics. General Shukla, would you also describe it as theatrics if Ukraine says at least 30% of Russian strategic bomber fleet has been taken out in A-50, the AWACS has been taken out, the Tu-22s, Tu-95s, a large number, 40 by Ukrainian account taken out?
See, I'll make 2 points. The initial point which Ambassador Sibbal was making. I'm also not warmongering, certainly not nuclear mongering. So if there are any ways to, keep things short of the nuclear threshold, it's very welcome. But to say that this technological innovation is theatrics is, I'm sure, in my view, less than wise. Let me tell you, what we are seeing in Ukraine is the most profound changes in the character of war since in recorded history. Recorded history. If Ukraine is in the fight today, it is on account of technological innovation. Look, here was a country without a navy and an air force. crew drones and Starlinks. What did they do to the Black Sea Fleet in Sevastopol? This is brilliant technological innovation. And the limited military point I'm making is that when legacy systems come up against technological innovation and legacy systems are not innovative, not entrepreneurial, they will suffer. And Ukraine's success is coming from the brilliance of people like Elon Musk, Palmer Luckey, Alex Carr. So let's not make this conclusion that technological innovation does not matter. It'll be less than wise. In the Indian context, I would say, let's embrace technological innovation 300%. 300%. And that's my limited point of disagreement with all the panelists. The other issue about nuclear warmongering and all, which Ambassador Sibbal said, I would agree 100%.
Okay, Ambassador Sibbal, you wanted to respond before I bring in Jill Bandwala. I also want to quickly cut across.
One short
Yeah,
point.
Go on, sir.
Are we interested in peace negotiations or dialogue and diplomacy? After all, after a lot of effort, pressure by Trump and others, the dialogue began again, peace talks began again in Istanbul. Now, obviously, the whole thing has been sabotaged very deliberately by Ukraine and its backers. So I don't see any future for these peace talks. Is that a good thing? We must reflect on this.
Jill Bandwala, Ukraine has been outthinking Russia, outsmarting them in several instances, even though on ground, Ukraine may have some spectacular kills and hits. On ground, Russia's taken more than 20% of Ukrainian territory. Is there merit that Russia is still coming out on top, as some argue, despite fighting the combined might of NATO partners in Ukraine?
Yeah, I'd like to just, with all due respect to General Shukla, I'd like to pour a little cold water on some of the narratives about drones. I mean, I think the idea that this is the most, taking nothing away from the Ukrainians and what they've done and the innovation we've seen in the last 3 years, the idea this is the most profound revolution in warfare. I mean, go back within the edge of living memory. You take a Churchill or an Eisenhower or people like that, in their lifetime, we went from horse cavalry to nuclear warfare. So the idea, I think drones are important. I think they both, in the tactical kind of close range battlefield fight and these longer strategic raids, I think they change things, but I think they're in a lot of ways, they kind of level the playing field. They allow weaker countries or second tier powers, a Ukraine or a Turkey or an Azerbaijan, to punch above their weight. But I think a lot of what drones do is replacing sometimes less efficiently conventional arms. You take artillery is a more efficient way to kill people close to the battlefield. Cruise missiles do a lot of what the Ukrainians do with drones because they don't have cruise missiles that reach that far, right? So to take nothing away from the audacity and the brilliance of what just happened, I think the old-fashioned arms still matter. And I think in a lot of ways, Russia's slow grinding progress in Ukraine that you're alluding to is about weight, is about manpower, is about old-fashioned tanks and artillery.
Okay. General Shukla, losing 30% of their strategic bomber fleet, a strategic blow to Russia in this war, or overall, Russia will look at the bigger picture, what it can gain in Ukraine. But God forbid, if this war were to expand, would Russia then have 30% less strategic assets to take on the might of NATO?
It's been crippling. The blow has been crippling. I'm told in Cold War I, the START talks between Reagan, Gorbachev, their predecessors and successors, shrunk the Russian nuclear force by 30%. That happened in 2 to 3 decades. Here in the space of a day, you shrunk the force by 30%. It is actually dramatic. Why are we in denial? And see what drones are doing. For example, today, any modern Air Force should have 50% piloted platforms and 50% unmanned. That is the reality. This is a unique technology moment. It is far greater than the stirrup and tank moment. This is something, and it is just not one technology. It is AI, it is precision targeting, Starlinks, everything coming together. My only, limited point of disagreement is in fact, Russian territory, their holding has shrunk from 30% to 20%. Russian holding of territory has shrunk because of technological innovation. And that's the only point. The Russians have taken a lot of, beating, their assaults. In fact, the lesson of Ukraine is what? Just 5 seconds. Trench warfare is predominant. Legacy platforms also exist. But these modern cutting-edge technologies have taken both these things to a new high. We should not be in denial about the third. That's my only point.
Absolutely. And Sandeep, when it comes to Russia's prestige, it's a huge blow, and not just one. I mean, just look at over the past 3 years. They may have gained territory, but Kremlin's been targeted. Moscow's repeatedly been targeted. Their Black Sea fleet lost their flagship, Moskva. Their territory has been targeted, their bridges have been targeted, and all using FPVs or missiles or innovative technology, or the use of course, NATO-based intelligence and Ukrainian manpower on ground.
Yeah, absolutely, Gaurav. Again, my point being the fact is that Russia has demonstrated through the 20th century an ability to absorb enormous punishment. If you look at what happened to them in Afghanistan, they lost something like 300 aircraft to Stingers manpads fired by the Mujahideen. These were supplied by the Western powers and the CIA. And they went through that war for 9 years. And before that, the Second World War, they won that war, but at enormous cost. At enormous cost. No nation has lost the kind of manpower and soldiers and civilians than Russia has lost in the Second World War. 20 million plus people. They lost so much of territory, but yet they came back, they destroyed the German, the Third Reich. And present day, I mean, all intelligence assessments point to a collapse of Russia and that fact that they wouldn't have the stamina to fight Ukraine on a sustained basis. But we are here, Gaurav, in 2025, more than 3 years after the invasion of Ukraine began, and Russia is still in the fight, is able to churn up enormous amounts of men and material and keep throwing it at the battlefield. Though I do believe that in the last few months, the battlefield has been frozen in Ukraine, Gaurav, and that's partly because of these drone walls that both countries have been throwing at each other, both Russia and Ukraine. They are literally the number one and the number two as far as drone warfare is in the world today. And this, actually, I tend to agree with General Shukla as well. Drones are, and all the technologies that they bring with it, possibly the most disruptive technology on the battlefield since the invention of the machine gun and the tank, the machine gun in the First World War and the artillery, and the tank and armored columns in the Second World War. So you're looking at drone warfare, it's here to stay, Gaurav, and look at the battlefield. It's emptied out of soldiers, it's emptied out of massed formations, it's completely disrupted this traditional thing of massing formations and maneuvering them to achieve military objectives. And
standoff weapons are weapons of the future. This disruptive technology is actually changing the nature of that battle, as you point out. But Professor Latham, what next? In your appreciation, the Istanbul peace talks, I'm told today, the agreement was only on prisoners of war exchange and nothing else. Do you see the peace talks become infructuous till Russia is able to hit back?
No, I think the peace talks will go nowhere. On the margins, yes, prisoner exchanges and things like that. But, and people have been saying this now for the last few months, that Putin has no incentive to be serious about peace talks because he knows his forces. The battlefield is not frozen. The Russians are advancing every day, not blitzkrieg. It's not France in 1940. It's more like France in 1916. But they're making advances every day. And as long, unless and until he captures and conquers those 4 oblasts, which, by the way, the Russian Constitution claims are inherent parts of the Russian Federation, and the land bridge to Crimea, he's not going to stop. He has no incentive to stop. Not his kids that are dying on the battlefield. Parenthetically, and getting back to some of the things that I've been writing about for the last 30 years, about the changing character of war, drones, it's an innovation on par with, as my colleague pointed out, the machine gun, certain kinds of artillery, aircraft, tanks. It's in that world. I mean, that's the way the battlefield is being transformed. And as I said earlier, the nature of war never changes. It's always about the use of, as Clausewitz told us, the use of violence to advance political objectives. But the character changes. Nobody would think that Napoleonic War was the same as the First World War, is the same as warfare today. These are consequential changes which governments need to be mindful of. And what we're seeing in Ukraine right now, not this theatrical strike, but what we're seeing on the battlefield is it's a laboratory.
Okay. Oh, it
And
indeed is a laboratory. There's no doubt.
yes,
No doubt.
yes.
Jill Bandola, the last 30 seconds I have on this part of the show. Does this also show that President Trump's efforts, whatever he may have tried, he hasn't succeeded at all? I mean, he said the moment I come into White House before my inauguration, there'd be a peace deal. Had I been president, there wouldn't have been war. Now he's been president for over 130 days, and the war perhaps has entered a very dangerous, turn. It's taken a dangerous turn.
Yeah, I think Trump clearly underestimated how intractable this conflict is and how far apart, as other panelists have mentioned today, how far apart the Ukrainians and the Russians are in their aims. And I think Ukraine feels it can't concede, de facto or de jure, the pieces of those four oblasts it still has. I think it's, I think Russia's aims, I agree that Russia is not trying to conquer all of Ukraine and probably doesn't think that's militarily feasible. But I think Russia wants a hobbled, weak Ukrainian state on its borders that has clear limits on its sovereignty and ability to defend itself. And to the Ukrainians, that is not national survival and sovereignty as a true state. So yeah, no, I think Trump is probably pretty clearly tiring of trying to play peacemaker and negotiate here and be the referee. And I think there are people in his coalition that are pushing him away from that. But I think that, as people have said, both countries are trying to pull Trump's sympathy towards them, and that's going to be a back and forth between Russia and Ukraine for the foreseeable future.
So we don't see peace on the horizon. Jill Bandola, 30 seconds. Do we see peace on the horizon or not?
Yeah, I agree with Professor Latham and others that I think we're going to have some marginal bits and pieces in negotiations and prisoner exchanges and things like that. But I think this war is going to keep grinding on for the foreseeable future.
Ambassador Sybil, is that also your appreciation? No peace on the horizon. It'll just keep grinding on?
Yes, definitely. You see, we are making a serious mistake. We are pitting Ukraine against Russia. It's not Ukraine against Russia. It's Ukraine plus Europe and earlier the United States. Once we get that right, then we know what is happening. Ukraine itself cannot take on Russia. It's a European war, which was earlier backed by the United States. And now, of course, Trump wants to end it. This is the reality.
And let's see what Trump does next. We'll track that story very closely. To all my guests, many thanks for joining me on this absolutely wonderful debate and discussion that we've had on a very difficult aspect of this conflict that's currently on.